Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm at AK Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 150. And this episode, we're coming at you in phases with new music and a wild arena and just something that's way larger and more ridiculous than it needs to be because we're talking about boss battles today.
We are. And also I would love for our community to design a Geoff and Matt boss battle. Like, what would it look like? What would the phases be? What would our weapons be? I don't know. Get crazy.
I mean, look, my ego demands it, but also my self-image. I don't know if you can unring that bell.
That's true. That is true. But yeah, I had realized very recently that while we've done a ton of what I would say the oeuvre of video game podcast topics, we hadn't really talked a lot about boss battles, and I've been thinking about them a lot for a lot of reasons. I have been playing through a bunch of different versions of Metroid 2 for an upcoming podcast somewhere Geoff and I are guesting, but also I've just been playing a ton of single-player games. I just finished Tears of the Kingdom, and so, boss battles had been on my mind. And, for the discussion today, I have two primary questions. Kind of one is, what makes a good boss battle? How do we define a good to great boss battle? But even more importantly, are all memorable boss battles good, right?
Yeah.
Because there are tons of boss battles I remember from games that were not fun or not good. And of course, then there are ones that I love that kind of live rent free in the back of my mind. I mean, to start the conversation, when I think about boss battles, the epitome of boss battle to me, I think because it's such a seminal game in my upbringing, is the first Bowser boss fight. And then, of course, the last Bowser boss fight in Super Mario 64, which are slightly different, but not completely. That boss fight was not complex, but from the music, the tone, the ambiance, the even minor narrative elements of him taunting you and stuff, all really kind of added up to what to me was for a long time the pinnacle of Mario boss battles, because it just felt very Mario, even though Mario had never done anything like that before. And the first two ones, you just have to blow up once, and then for the final one, the ground around you falls out as, I guess, spoilers for Super Mario 64, who cares? As you do that boss battle and you have to get all three bombs, and the arena you're on falls out from a circle to a star shape. And it's really interesting. And mechanically, it's not that diverse, but it is putting your skills of the game to the test, which is to start, I think a big thing that we see often within boss battles is it's a culmination of what you've been doing up until the point that you hit it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Whether it is learning new techniques or collecting items, it puts your use of those things to the test, your knowledge of the environment or of weaknesses or of the mechanics of the game. If it's something where it's turn-based and you have to worry about when you guard, when you don't guard, those sort of skill checks that happen are very much part and parcel of certainly a lot of boss battles, if not necessarily good ones or memorable ones, but those are also the case. Although I kind of want to go even earlier in this idea.
Yeah.
What makes a boss fight at all? Because a lot of those qualities of a good boss fight, and they are very much from the arcadey challenge-based idea of things. Fighting Bowser is important because we have fought Bowser so many times. So every time it comes up, it's important. But there are other games where it's less about the challenge of who you're fighting or the threat they pose to you, but the stakes that are had. I think a lot of what makes a boss battle is the stakes involved, whether it's because this is a game where you only have so many lives or there's a huge setback if you were to fall or fail. The risk and the stakes are in overcoming the challenge. If you are facing off against a story-appropriate challenge, a former friend, a seemingly untouchable foe one way or another that has been dogging your steps this whole way, those are also very big stakes. I mean, we put out a call to Twitter and to Discord and to all the usual channels for these sorts of things, and Commander Nikki, who did a side quest fairly recently as well, mentions specifically one of the boss battles from Spider-Man Miles Morales, but Spider-Man games in general are fantastic in terms of challenge posed by mechanics and by threat to your digital mortality, but also because you care about these people. You know, Spider-Man fighting Harry Osborn is always one of those kinds of things of, I don't want to die, but I also don't want to hurt my best friend. And so it is having that classic Spider-Man thing of having to fight a friend and not wanting to, making everything all the more tense while you are trying to survive and make it past the challenge, whether that's a final boss or that is at some point in the procedure, those stakes are very important.
For sure. I mean, even the first Spider-Man game for PS4, you're working as Peter Parker. These are spoilers, I guess, but if you're a comic book fan on any level, you know a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, that's why I'm being vague, but you get the idea. If you know the character.
Right, sure. But like for Dr. Octavius, like, you know he's going to be Dr. Octopus. Like, we just know that's going to happen if you've literally consumed any Spider-Man stuff. But still, when that moment happens in the game and you have to fight him, it's like, or any game when you have to fight him, it's like, oh shit, what am I going to do? Or a ton of the famous Venom narratives are like, Spider-Man doesn't want to hurt Eddie Brock. Like, Eddie Brock's just a guy, at least initially,
right.
You know. And then when he becomes more closely related to Venom and like they become more as one, then he's kind of lost to it. But like with superheroes specifically, boss battles have a lot more weight because there's always a narrative impact. I mean, you have to think about these rogues galleries and these comic book characters. Most of the time, they don't want to fight. I mean, I guess you could argue Wolverine wants to fight. Wolverine will fight anybody. But like most of the time, characters like Spider-Man and Batman and Superman and whoever else, they don't necessarily want it to resort to violence, but often they don't have a choice. And when it does, it can really, I think, enhance those moments. You know, Nostalgium Pod talks about the Mr. Freeze battle in Arkham City, which is one of my favorite boss battles. A good boss fight should feel like a test of your skills you've learned up to this point and a true duel. And like the thing about Mr. Freeze in the Batman narrative, if you're not a Batman fan, is that he's just trying to save his wife. Of course, he's done some horrible things to do it, but he has frozen his wife in ice, in stasis, to keep her from dying from a life-threatening disease. And his whole life is just trying to cure her. That's all he cares about. And so that boss fight in Arkham City, there's a mutual respect at the start of it between Batman and Mr. Freeze, and yet they still have to fight. And on the harder difficulties, like there are different things you can do in Arkham City to get a jump on Mr. Freeze and punch him and try and break his suit. You can do the same ones over and over again in the easier difficulties, but in the harder difficulties, you have to use different methods each time because he sees you coming otherwise. And so like that also is being enhanced by knowing these characters and how smart they are. It's just those kinds of things I think can absolutely elevate the stakes of any boss fight.
Yeah, and I think the Arkham series in general does a very nice job of that. Not every encounter with a rogue and not every boss fight is an incredible, amazing one, but some truly superlative encounters have happened there. And part of it is the appropriateness to the characters. The encounter with Killer Croc in Arkham Asylum, that is not all of Batman's rogues are physically imposing challenges. The boss fight of dealing with Scarecrow is the encounter with the environment, which also boss fights can be very much about that. It doesn't necessarily have to be the opponent. It is the challenge itself. If you want to stretch the definition, I think that covers it. And I could say that, you know, you're not even really hitting Scarecrow, but you are boss fighting Scarecrow. Killer Croc, a physically imposing figure. But the point is the terror and the hit and run aspect of the entire thing and what you have to do when you fight Bane in terms of utilizing how the venom affects his mind to just sort of drive him into areas where you could then just start to kind of disable him. These feel appropriate to your opponent and to the matchup that you're having. An interesting thing for me is with boss fights and boss encounters, certainly older games, due to limited palettes, limited space and everything else, the boss is basically, it might just be a regular guy colored a little differently. I think of stuff like Kung Fu on the NES. You might be dealing with some slightly different sprites, but it's not too crazy. Or the Double Dragon games, you know, lots of beat 'em ups and things like that, where the point is waves and waves of enemies. And then it's like, well, this is one of them, but got a new hat or a pipe or just a little bigger. Although on that side, I do really enjoy when like someone who is a boss in the very beginning of the game shows up as a regular encounter later.
That happens in Streets of Rage a lot,
Streets of Rage, I think of Castlevania games, I think of, any of those games where not only does that show how high the stakes have been raised, but it also shows how far you've come. The very first boss in the first level, first area of a game that might have given you trouble while you were getting a hang of what the mechanics were, getting a bead on what everything was, you are now encountering a slew of them. Or sometimes that also, in a storyline way, if they were something unique and now you're facing off against somebody who is just making clones of them, a la Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars, where you're dealing with machine-smithed versions of previous bosses and foes, also drives something home and also raises the stakes.
Yeah. Before we get too far from the Arkham series, which I agree with you, does have some of the best boss fights in the history of video games, except for one, at least one, which is the final boss of Arkham Asylum. Arkham Asylum's final boss is a Joker fight where Joker becomes infected by Venom and becomes essentially a Joker-Bane hybrid. And the problem with it is we talked about aesthetic story impact. Like, the whole point of the Joker is that you could beat him in a physical fight pretty easily. It's his cunning, his wit, his ability to torture you, his mental games that make him a good villain. And when you make him a brute as the final boss, it just deflated what was an almost perfect game up to that point. And it's what stops Arkham Asylum for me being a perfect game. It is one of my favorite games of all time and one of the best 3D Metroidvanias. But that final boss fight is just like, what's the point? Even though mechanically, yeah, it does do all the things that a boss fight should. Narratively, it just feels completely deflated because that's not what that's about. Whereas when you fight Clayface at the end of the second game, it's like, okay, this makes sense, right? Clayface is this overwhelming monster. It should be difficult or whatever. And so, yeah, for me, that's where like it just misses the mark. But I completely agree that like the Nintendo era kind of set the stage for a lot of how we look at boss fights now. You think about the Mega Man franchise, where the boss fight is the whole game, right? You're picking stages based on the bosses, and then the whole stage is themed to that boss, more or less. You know, Quick Man and Flash Man aside, who have like stuff that's like, why is this in his stage? Okay, sure.
I don't know. You got to be pretty quick to dodge those freaking lasers in the Quick Man stage.
That's true.
And you don't have to slide yet. You're screwed.
Yeah, you just got to run your ass. But like Mega Man, the whole franchise, Mega Man and Mega Man X, completely designed around boss battles. The final boss fight of most of those games are either Sigma or Dr. Wily. And like they're the hardest fights that incorporate multiple phases, that incorporate multiple of the weapons that you got, that you need to use. And it's trial and error to figure out what works if you don't have a guide, right? And I think that kind of risk appropriate challenge is also early on in the Nintendo era. I mean, we haven't talked about Metroid yet, but you think about games that don't give you a freaking clue and you've got to figure it out on your own. First couple of Metroid games were like that, but like this idea of testing the skills up until that point, like you mentioned, one of my fondest and least fond memories of Metroid Dread, which I think I told in the Metroid Dread episode, was you get the cluster missile in that game, which is like these homing missiles that you shoot out. And I just got them and then get to a boss. I kept dying on that boss. I'm like, I can't beat this freaking boss. I don't understand it. Why can't I beat this guy? It should be easy. And then I used the cluster missiles and went, oh.
Yep.
And like the fight's a cakewalk if you use the ability they gave you. But because I was just kind of set in my ways, and I was like, oh, I don't need this new ability now. I'm fine. I know how to play a Metroid game. I completely went against what the game was heavily implying in a better way than the earlier games. I got my ass handed to me for hours and couldn't figure it out until I Googled it and went, I'm an idiot. But like, that's something that the Metroid franchise got much better at and is, I feel like, very good at now, is setting flag posts of like, here's this ability, you just got it, and then a few moments later you're going to get to a boss. I wonder if that ability will really help me with this boss. Oh, look, it does, kind of a thing.
Right, which is both good and bad historically for the Legend of Zelda franchise.
Sure.
Which is definitely a series where you are finding objects and artifacts and things of power and new methods and means of fighting and transportation, etc., where there definitely got to a point where you could almost feel like, well, I found this in this temple. I wonder if I'm going to use it on the boss I'm going to be fighting at the end of this temple.
Yeah.
Golly.
Yeah, the 3D Zelda games were really guilty of that, especially since Ocarina of Time on through the Wii era. Like they pretty much did it one-to-one, which is why like Link Between Worlds, which was the spiritual successor to Link to the Past and one of my favorites, that one still did that. But because you could rent any item at any time in that game, you could go to any dungeon at almost any time also, which was, I think, a more interesting way of doing it, but still leans into that trope.
Oh, yeah, because I don't think doing that at all is some sort of mortal sin or some kind of horrible mistake to be making in your game design. I think it becomes a matter of, are you railroading people? What sort of choices are you giving them? And how are you rewarding or punishing how on plan people are? Something I really enjoyed about Final Fantasy X as a battle system, as a game, was because you were able to swap in party members for free, like no cost of time at any point, they could more particularly design each character around certain kinds of challenges against airborne enemies, faster enemies, armored enemies, weak to magic, weak to physical. Because if you aren't building your party, your character, if you go out of order in terms of going to dungeons in a game or whatever, and you don't have that one specific thing, I feel that that is letting people down. Whether you call it a failure or not is up to you, but I do feel it is letting people down. It is letting the game design down even. And so allowing for renting items in Link Between Worlds, allowing for swapping in characters means that you can make a more diverse challenge and a more interesting design for what you're doing. Because I think also something that makes for great boss fights is a shift.
Yeah.
Of some kind, whether that is a shift in perspective or arena. The Super Mario 64 Bowser fights, yeah, you're running around and you're doing that stuff anyway, but you don't do it necessarily on that precarious of an arena. Even before stuff starts falling in the later fights, you are utilizing all of the same skills, all of the same things you're doing differently. I mean, the final boss fight, really the boss fight of Super Mario World, where you fight Bowser in the clown car. You can't jump on Bowser. You can't shoot Bowser with fireballs. That's how I stop things in Mario.
Right.
What? No. Everything's wrong, but it's not. I mean, yes, you throw things at them too, and you have been spending the whole game being able to more accurately throw shells and objects than you had in previous Mario games. And so something where you are avoiding the clown car, you need to stomp on a Mecha Koopa and throw it in such a way that it hits Bowser. None of these things were completely new mechanics. You didn't need the cape, you didn't need to be Fire Mario, you could be any form of Mario you needed to be. And you could utilize those skills, you had to shift them up a little bit and change up how you were doing it. And because it happened in sort of phases, it happened kind of like, all right, you gotta do it a few times. Peach shows up, says help, throws you a mushroom, helps you out. There's that tension of, you play enough video games, we all become very familiar with that. Okay, it takes like one more hit, two more hits. I need to wait for them to come around, and that is when you lose it. That mile from home kind of difficulty and those stakes going up. But it is just that slight shift that I think also makes for unique, well-designed, memorable, good boss fights. Not just this guy, but bigger, but the arena opens up. The other good shift in perspective for Mario boss battles is Mario World 2. Yeah. With Baby Bowser just looming in the background, coming for you. It is cinematic as hell.
Yeah.
And a fun fight.
Yeah, totally. The funny thing about the Super Mario World boss is that you could go that whole game without ever throwing something up. You can always throw things forward pretty easily. You let go of the button, you throw it forward. But you could ideally play that game without ever throwing something upwards.
Right, and they teach you, they give you a setup with a little speaker box and everything in one of the first levels. You could completely ignore it. They don't stop you and go, hey, this is going to be important later.
Right.
You just go, and you're right. You could go the whole game and never do that, but it's not as if you had to build around it or anything else. It just, there it is.
Yeah. I mean, I also like that good consistent boss fights can be like a shift on a theme. Mm-hmm. I think about pretty much every Kirby boss battle and every Kirby game and how Wispy Woods, in every game, you fight that tree. But as you get to the 3D games, some of the 3DS games, like the boss fight's always a little bit different. I remember one of the more recent Kirby games. I don't know if it was Return to Dreamland or one of them, but like he jumps. His roots come out of the ground and he jumps over you. And I went, what the hell? He's supposed to be stationary. Like, I like that they've taken your expectations of this boss you fight in every game, but they turned it on their head just a little bit. There are several bosses in the Kirby franchise that have done that, like the Lightning Cloud, whose name I can't remember. Kracko. In one of his versions of his boss fight, you're like flying his jet Kirby and like chasing him and like shooting him with puffs of air or whatever. I think that when you've long-running franchises like we're talking about Zelda, Mario, and others, you have to change that stuff up. Like, I would hate to be a boss designer for any action platformer, or especially action game. Think Bayonetta, Devil May Cry, the recent Hi-Fi Rush. Like, because of the way those systems work and how it's based on skill and it's based on timing, the boss fights all have to take that into consideration, plus whatever new weapons you've got, new abilities you've unlocked. And I think just because they're more complex doesn't make them better, but I think it's an interesting way of design, whereas like Mega Man's Rock, Paper, Scissors, Like, super simple, but in execution can be complicated. Any of those action games, I think one of my favorite boss fights in a long time from Hi-Fi Rush, which is I can't remember the name of the first robot you fight, but he's essentially used to deal with defects. Like, it's the first time you hear a license track, and like you land, you see this giant robot, Nine Inch Nails, 1 Million starts to play, you gear up for the fight, and then you fight him. And like, that boss fight is all vibes, all atmosphere and aesthetics. Like, I'm pumped to fight my first boss in that game, but I'm also pumped because I'm listening to one of my favorite Nine Inch Nails songs. And it's just kind of also gives you the first run of like timing, the beat, the first ability that you unlocked, and all of that stuff. And I think it's just, especially for character action games, it's a cool way. And I think a lot of those kinds of games, and even the Souls games, which are kind of an evolution of those character action games, like, all depend on vibes and atmosphere and challenge. And I think that can make just as good a boss fight as the other ones that we're talking about, that kind of test the skills and MacGuffins you found up to that point.
Yeah. I think actually, now that we're talking about this, probably the most memorable boss fights are the first ones and the final ones.
Yeah.
Because the final one's got to send you off right, be thematically appropriate, story needs to be wrapped up, or just, it needs to be a culmination. Whereas the first boss is one that everyone will encounter, and it sets the stage, sets the mood, teaches you a little bit about what the game is. One teaches, the other tests, I suppose, but they both do anyway. And then there's, of course, very memorable ones throughout as well. But I find a lot of times when people bring these up, it's like, oh, it's this one or it's that one. There is fighting Magus in Chrono Trigger.
Sure.
Which is a deeply memorable fight for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which it has its own boss music.
Yeah. I mean, boss music, I think, is really key to boss fights. I think any boss fight that just utilizes the music that you already had is fine. But like, you think about, I mentioned the Souls games before. I think the reason that, especially for me, Elden Ring hit so hard is because every time you fought a boss, it had its own theme. The health bar shows up out of nowhere sometimes. And like, it's all about that mood and scene setting. And the music is a big part of it. I mean, Magus is probably one of my favorite boss fights of all time, and has one of the best boss songs of all time.
And has the vibes as you approach. The music starts and you are walking up, and the candles light as you approach him. And just from the moment you appear in that room, it is dripping in style.
Yeah, I mean, a boss fight can definitely be memorable without all that stuff, but I think the most memorable ones, like we mentioned Magus, like Kefka. I mean, think about One Winged Angel, right? Like, that battle is memorable because of the vibes. Because the battle itself, besides some of his abilities, isn't that different, right? It's still the same systems. Like, you've got more powerful spells and stuff and abilities and weapons, but like, you're not really playing the game that differently. But then Meteor happens, and you get to endure that freaking like feast for the eyes and ears.
Oh, Supernova, that like
Supernova,
3-minute long animation of all the planets exploding.
I think that's just as much aesthetics as anything else. And I think a good RPG battle for sure is more aesthetic than anything else. I mean, I think that some of the more memorable bosses that are mentioned by folks who submitted stuff are all these RPG or action game bosses that are like, just, it's all set piece. And then, of course, it's also everything else. I mean, like Dave from Tales of the Backlog mentions Ludwig from Bloodborne, who I've not fought myself, though I do plan to play Bloodborne at some point, but I've definitely watched before. And Dave says, I think an ideal boss battle has a cool story significance, memorable visual design, and music. They should also be mechanically satisfying and or testing the mechanics that were taught throughout that level. Most memorable to me is probably Ludwig from Bloodborne. Insanely good music that mirrors what's happening in the fight with the character, challenging from a mechanical standpoint, and an insane visual design, which this is what we're talking about here. And I don't think good boss battles have to have all of them, but it definitely has a lot of those things.
Right. I mean, as far as style or anything else goes, I did mention Metal Gear earlier on. I think we would be remiss in talking about boss battles if we didn't talk about the Psycho Mantis fight from Metal Gear Solid.
Sure.
Which is something where, is it a particularly challenging boss fight? No more or less than any other one. But is it thematically appropriate to your opponent? Yes. One where you need to overcome strange challenges in order to be able to best him. Yes, you got to plug your controller into controller port 2. Do they do a good job of telling you that? No. They will. They try to be cute and coy about it, then eventually tell you outright. And there's other ways to still win the fight and still be able to have control, even if you are playing a PlayStation where the second controller board doesn't work. They designed that far, I suppose. And everything about reading your memory card and telling you about how you've been playing and everything else is very thematic for throwing you on the back foot. It's a very memorable boss fight, but I'm not going to say it's a good boss fight.
No. Yeah. I mean, well, like one of my most memorable Sega Genesis boss fights is against Mojo.
Oh, in X-Men.
In X-Men. But it's not memorable for that boss fight itself. That boss fight is pretty rote. It's memorable because after you beat him, nothing happens. The game doesn't progress. But then you see Professor X on the TV screens and it says reset the danger room. And you're like, I don't know what that means. But if you reset the console, the game starts up again and you're outside of the danger room now. And you are going after Magneto, who turned the danger room on you. And like, that's such a cool idea. That is more the after effect of the boss fight than the boss fight itself, but it is encompassed in that whole like scene setting of that fight.
And there is something to be said for those moments. It's because, again, the boss fights themselves, we're not exactly saying good or bad things about specific people if we're saying it about the boss fight necessarily. I know there's designers, but the kind of thing of like, oh, Mojo's a crappy boss fight. Mojo's not coming for you now. But what it does for the experience of playing X-Men, well, that's something. And that definitely elevates the game for what is, honestly, graphics and fan service aside, a fairly middling platformer.
For sure, yeah. I mean, and we're talking about music. I mean, Barry Leon, previous guest of this very show, said on Twitter, like, the music, of course, is what elevates a boss fight. Kefka, Sephiroth, Lavos, Hades, Red, K. Rool, Sans, need I go on? And Leon is right. Like, those RPG battles and platformer battles, I think, stand out so much because those moments in those boss battles. I mean, in Hades, you're going to fight Hades. It's the namesake of the game. Like, they don't be coy about that at all, that Hades is going to be your final boss. But still, when you get to that moment and he takes off the cape and he's just standing there and the music starts, and it's based on the main theme of the whole game, it's like, oh no, shit's about to hit the fan. Mm-hmm. It's like I remember the Mario Brothers 3 Bowser theme and how it got remixed in Super Mario RPG with the first fight against Bowser. Like,
yeah.
That song is still a bop. And like, we've talked at length about how important music is to games, but I would argue and agree with myself, I guess, that boss fights are absolutely defined by their music. And without memorable music, unless everything else is on point, those boss fights are hard to stick with you.
Yeah. No, it's, if I were giving a facetious, flippant answer to be like, Geoff, what makes a boss fight? Tunes. Is it a boss fight? I don't know. Is it playing boss music or is it playing their own theme? Because, it doesn't have to be the standard boss music, but it needs to be different music. Because it's music and sound design in a game is one of the core pillars in setting the mood, in moving the player along and how we interact with the experience itself, the same way that you can watch a film without music, but I don't know. You take the music out of truly epic moments and it feels watered down. It feels lesser. And where in video games, we are able to engage with more in anything, whether it is stamping papers to decide whether or not they come in and out of the country, or fighting God, who is also your dad, who is also whatever. Having the appropriate boss music is one of, I don't know how many core pillars of setting that mood, setting that stage, and again, raising those stakes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the atmosphere is really important. And like we've talked about the arena, we've talked about the music, but I think sound design is also important. And like you have a note here about, persistent bosses. Think Mr. X and Nemesis. Like, that is all sound design until you're face to face with them. It's the stomping, it's the breaking of doors, it's whatever else.
Which in its own way is music. Or whether music is the sound or sound is the music. It is, it's that signifier. It is, when Hades takes the cape off and the music starts, it's on. When you approach Magus, this is happening. Playing Final Fantasy VII, all fights start with the same, like, twisting, blurring of the screen. But what kind of fight it is, whether or not it's the regular fight music or heavily distorted rock guitar kicks in.
Yeah, Absolutely. And like, I mean, I also think about like aesthetic and mood setting. Like, of course, we have to talk about Shadow of the Colossus, which I only played for the first time a few years ago. And like, that's the whole game is exploration and boss fights because the
Yeah.
whole Titan, the whole Colossus is the boss fight. And that's boss fight in a different way, right? Because you're climbing these bosses looking for weak points, but like, you are not fighting the boss is fighting you, right? You are
Yeah.
fighting the climbing, the interaction, the not falling off, but like the creature itself, it's not a direct one-to-one fight because you're climbing all over it.
Right. And this is one where one could argue, are they boss fights if they're the only kind of fight? And given the atmosphere of game design in the PS2 era when Shadow of the Colossus came out, there was no other way to speak of it, really, in a populist kind of way than to say it's 16 boss fights and running around finding them. Because, yeah, this is the culmination of the Mega Man idea. You're selecting the fight. You're selecting the arena with which to get to the fight that is also the fight. It is all of those things. The fight is the arena is the fight. This is why Team Ico stuff is always so fun in the our games are argument, because you can just sit here and be wildly pretentious for hours. And I might, but not today. But Shadow of the Colossus is wonderful exploration of those sorts of fights and those sort of stakes. And while they become adventurous and adventuresome, they don't have the same kind of direct, I want to say, emotional stakes or emotional tension that you might think of when you're facing massive titans. It really is, they're trying to fight you off and you're fighting with your own conscience about that. Is this worth it? Yeah. Are we seeing this through to the end? And I do always love when a story confronts you with the notion that you can always just walk away, because that's when it's tragedy. And I love that. But Shadow of the Colossus doesn't necessarily beat you over the head with that kind of idea of, you're the one who chose to keep doing this. You're the one who loves this violence. No, it says far less. And I think with that, it speaks to you far more.
For sure. I mean, and this brings us to like boss fights. Obviously, we haven't really talked too much about challenge, but like ideally, that's what a lot of them are, right? But what does that challenge mean? And I think for me, it's funny, the challenging boss fights that like I die multiple times, I have patience for those if I'm learning in the process. I think one of the things that I talked about in our Metroid Dread side quest episode is that Metroid Dread did something that I found me the ability to appreciate boss fights in the Souls games as I start to explore them is even though you die a lot, are you learning something every time you die? And in Metroid Dread, I did. Like every time I went back to a boss fight, I was like, all right, I get a quarter of a health. I get half its health. I get 2/3 of its health. I always felt like I was making progress, learning the mechanics, learning how to do it. And that's one of the things that kept me going in Elden Ring and Dark Souls 3 was this idea that even if I was dying, I was learning something about the boss fight or about myself or how to use the mechanics. And that's something that's hard to teach, but when done well, like the testing of skills, I think is a really important part of it. Now, do I need every boss fight to be challenging or hard as hell? No. Famously, and Dave and I talk about this at length in a Tales of the Backlog episode I did about the Yakuza franchise, those boss fights suck 90% of the time. Unfortunately, the Yakuza game just make difficult boss fights. I mean, you've experienced all the boss fights in Like a Dragon.
Yep, I just finished last week.
Which won't get confusing when they change the whole series to Like a Dragon as they're doing with the next entry. But, you know, it's fine. But like that game, some of those boss fights aren't that bad. And then you get to the Legends of Yakuza boss fights. And it's like the spike is inexplicably high. And there's no real reason for it. And in the same way, a lot of the beat 'em up games, like the regular fights are fine. Some of the boss fights are fine and fun. And then you get to the later game boss fights and you're like, why is this so hard? Why am I dying all the time? And there's usually a way around it, buying more health items, leveling up, whatever it is. But I think that's something that we should cover, not just the challenge of boss fights, but when it's an appropriate challenge. What does that mean, right? Which I don't know if there's a clear right answer, but we have a vibe of that answer, right? Like where the wall is too thick, when you hit a boss wall and you're like, I can't do this.
Yeah, and I think some of that is where a lot of game design nowadays, what we are able to do, capable of doing, is allowing for multiple ways of assailing the same challenge. You know, the sort of Deus Ex idea, as far as a classic one goes, where you don't have to fight your way out of everything. But sometimes it works to have one specific solution, because no matter what, when you play the game, you're going to have that solution. And you need to figure that out and become comfortable with it one way or another. And other times it's, well, you didn't find this item. Or to speak to Yakuza playing Like a Dragon, Sarah and I ran into a big fight with a classic character from the previous games who was giving us a lot of trouble. And a lot of that came from the fact that he has one weakness, ice. And none of your characters in their main job naturally get ice damage. And I don't think very many weapons give it to you either. You need to diversify in the job system. Well, Sarah's the one holding the controller and decided that, well, it's better to have party diversity. I'm not running into a ton of elemental weaknesses. Okay, yeah, they're weak to that, but I'm also beating them, so this isn't a problem. And then suddenly, it was crucial. And so I took up the controller and took some time and diversified everybody's jobs and got everyone some of those skills that you can take from outside the job to your main one. And so, like, all right, everyone can do ice damage. Some folks can do some lightning. Some folks can do some fire. We've got a more diverse party makeup. And that helped us out a great deal going through the rest of the game. Once we did that, it's like, okay, some things clicked. But we were able to go 12 chapters into this game before that became anything resembling a problem.
Right.
I don't know whether that is a fault on our end or on their end.
Right.
Or if there's even a fault. But it is a matter of these situations happen. And I think good boss fights and good challenges like this are ones where, well, what do you bring? Is that going to work? Is that not going to work? Or not even is it going to work, not going to work? Is that going to be effective? More effective or less effective? I mean, hey, yeah, I do love a great challenging boss. I love a nail biter. But I also so appreciate bosses that I don't know what their pattern is in an RPG because they're undead. And that means if I just throw a healing item at them, they die instantly.
Yeah.
I love that. I love being rewarded for my knowledge as a gamer. Being like, oh, zombie, let me throw a cure at it. Let me revive it. That will probably kill it. And usually, nowadays, if that is being averted or swerved on one way or another, I want to see what happens. You almost get a little, in the way that old Konami games used to give you little Easter eggs. If you used the Konami code, sometimes it would give you all of the cool things. Sometimes it would blow you up. But no matter what, do the Konami code on all the games. Throw a phoenix down at all of the undead. See what happens. I feel good being rewarded for that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's my favorite boss fight in 7, where you're fighting this ghost in the tomb of Red 13's home.
Jinanatuk, yes.
Yeah, and you just throw Phoenix down and it dies instantly. Like, I love that when I discovered that. Like, it's video game logic, but
I don't know what the boss does.
No, I've never
seen it do anything.
I've never fought. Well, it's like the time that a friend of the show, my buddy Matt, went and was doing a no materia run and fought Emerald Weapon underwater and noticed that its most powerful attack did almost no damage and couldn't understand why. And then went, oh my God, it's materia based. You're so reliant on materia by the time you get to that boss fight that if you fight that weapon and have a full set of materia, it does damage based on what materia you have. But if you have none, it barely does damage. And like those kinds of discoveries make, I think, the best and worst boss fights, just because it's those like face smacking moments. Like, why didn't I think of this?
Right. And those are encounters that run long enough or happen often enough or are universal enough when you play through the game that they make for those memorable moments. To continue with Final Fantasy VII, there is a completely story agnostic boss fight in Icicle Cave in the frigid north that is a two-headed dragon. That just shows up suddenly in a hallway. That is its entire point. You walk down a hallway, you talk to a guy, boss music kicks in. One head does fire damage, one head does ice damage. And the fun that can be had with having to build and figure out your party, because they're very strong, but also you have enough to your arsenal by materia, through armor, through accessories, through whatever else, that you can usually have, okay, you absorb fire, you absorb ice, you do these things, we're figuring that stuff out. I actually, one time when I was streaming Final Fantasy VII, my controller lost battery power in the middle of that fight.
Oh, no.
But because I had killed one of the heads, I can't remember if it was doing the fire or ice, but whatever it was, Tifa and my party absorbed the other element. And so I had to run and get a cable and plug this in and like, oh no, I wasn't doing great with getting these things synced up. So I had to take a few minutes there. And I was like staring at the screen and I'm not going to die. I can't die. Not like this. Once I start fighting again, there'll be counterattacks and things can be a challenge, but oh my God. Is that good design? I don't know. Probably not. But it was super memorable, and I'm always going to have a good chuckle whenever I fight that dragon now. So boss fights in their scale, in their scope, are big enough where whether they are memorable, a stepping stone, a tutorial, a puzzle, whatever it is, they're big enough and they're long enough that they can make the memories and they can make those aha moments of, oh, I need to flip this guy over. Oh, the weak point's here. Oh, I need to wait, whatever it is.
Yeah, totally. And that's a big RPG thing. I mean, Michael from Bits of Time, I need stakes to feel the high. There also needs to be an either epic set piece or move set or emotional undertone. And like mainly looking at this through an RPG lens, which is what we're talking about. Like these fights feel larger than life because of the narrative attachment to them. Super Pod Saga mentions Lucifer from SMT4. Lucifer is very gruesome and intimidating, but the music played during this fight is absolutely foreboding, and the entire battle feels like a fight to the death. Like the gravitas of a battle, especially in these settings, can only be enhanced by those things. And I think it's when it's really attached to the narrative. I mean, you mentioned a narrative agnostic boss. I feel like that's an RPG trope. Like you think about Culex, who's a Final Fantasy boss in Super Mario RPG, like a legit boss from a different Final Fantasy game.
Oh, no. He was made up for Mario RPG.
Well, but he's like designed in the style.
Okay, no, you're right. Yeah. He's like as if pulled from.
Right. And his whole narrative, like the brief, bizarre conversation you have with him hints that he's from a Final Fantasy game. Like he's from another world and he's trapped here or whatever.
He has crystals. He moves and floats the way that a Final Fantasy boss of the Super Famicom era does. Yeah, it's everything.
And like that is literally just, let's put that RPG boss in this RPG game. And it's still really exciting and interactive. And like we mentioned before about like where you find these boss fights, like my buddy Joe mentions location. A good boss fight has a unique location, soundtrack, ambiance. Even as far back as Super Mario, you face Bowser on Rickety Bridge with your hope being an axe resting behind him. A boss without a good boss stage is a waste. And like, I agree. I think some of these RPG bosses that we mentioned before and all of the other kinds, it's just as much where you're fighting as what you're fighting and why you're fighting.
Right. I would say two in particular that I'm going to reference that I'm going to not talk about too much, because if you wanted to play these games unspoiled, play them. If you want to just know about them, just look up these fights. Fighting Sans in Undertale.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about averting tropes, about emotional connection, about great music, about vibes as hell, yeah, look it up. Have a great time. And I'm not even going to say particular bosses, but there are some truly great ones in Nier Automata.
Sure.
The music doesn't become big, crazy rock guitar. It continues its sort of pseudo-operatic kind of style, but it does raise the stakes a little. And several of them have incredible arenas or shifting of what abilities you do or do not have access to, or who it is that you're fighting. There's some truly great ones there. And sometimes going at the story again from a different perspective and finding other things about said fights. But I even think one of the coolest things that a major late game fight in Yakuza Like a Dragon did was, at that point, none of the bosses were giving me a challenge.
Right.
And this one was no exception. But what it did do was it was story appropriate, story heart-wrenching even, and made it a one-on-one fight. Yeah. And not only was it a one-on-one fight, early in the game, when the job classes become a thing, Ichiban Kasuga, his main job upgrades from freelancer to hero.
Yeah.
And with that, it's when he like pulls a bat out of the ground like it's Excalibur. This is early, and even knowing that, watch the cutscene. It's incredible. But that last fight, it's one-on-one, and he doesn't have his bat. He's a freelancer again. None of us have leveled up freelancer ever since we got hero. But you have the abilities, you have that happen, and it makes it all the more just who you're fighting is not the biggest bad on the streets or anything like that. This is a story fight, and your opponent fights exactly as well as you would expect that person to do. That's not the point. This is just haymakers and slugfest. And it still was a bit of a challenge because it's just me. So I don't have, the person that I have as my healer in the party or anything like that. There's still some stuff there. We finally had to use some consumable items, which I think Sarah is actually physically allergic to doing. And it was a fun challenge, but it wasn't anything that I was like, oh, God, no, they completely screwed me over here. They took away your bat, but you never leveled up Freelancer? That's fine. What level are you? What level was Hero? Cool. You have all the Freelancer stuff unlocked up to that level, which usually at that point was all of the abilities. So it was great. And I was still able to finish the fight and feel like it was emotionally satisfying and satisfying in a challenge kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, I think comforts being removed like that and like key mechanics being locked are really important. I think of a really memorable Super Mario RPG, Legend of the Seven Stars, got to say the full title, boss fight against Bowyer, I never know how to pronounce Bowyer, who's just literally a living bow because it took me till I was a fucking adult to realize that all of the smithy enemies are weapons.
Yep.
Because I'm a genius. But in that fight, there are 3 buttons on the battlefield reflecting your attack, items, and special moves. And throughout the fight, he locks those buttons and you can't use those abilities. And like taking that stuff away, like for me, someone who over levels and rationing flower points in the same way I ration items, like, all right, I'll just use regular attacks. That's what I'm using anyway. But like, it's a cool thing that's completely meta. And like, there's no narrative reason why he can do that. The designers literally went, now we're going to lock your buttons. You got to fight this fight differently. And I love that. I think that really good boss fighters do. I mean, also the Smithy boss fight music is some of the best boss fight music in the history of video games. I'm hearing it in my head literally as we're talking, but like,
yeah,
I think those kinds of things are also really good where you like kind of the character for narrative or even non-narrative reasons is locked out of a skill or thing. And you have to rethink how to do those fights. I think some of my favorite Zelda fights are the ones where you have to rely on this item to like unlock how to defeat this boss. And then once you figure that out, but then in games like Tears of the Kingdom where you have all these other things as resources, it's like, well, now there's not one way to beat these bosses. I mean, there is sort of one way to beat these bosses, but you have options, you have alternatives within that one way. And I think games that make you rethink how to fight bosses are just as fun as the ones that have narrative significance. And I'm at a loss of thinking of more other than the Mr. Freeze battle I mentioned before, where it slowly locks you out of different ways to fight him until there are only a few left. But like those kinds of things where you really focus in and go, okay, what the hell did I learn for the last 5 hours? Can I figure out how to fight this thing? I think is a really cool way of making you rethink how to interact with those bosses.
Absolutely. And even things like the Bowyer fight in Super Mario RPG, Legend of the Seven Stars, he will lock the button you use the most up to that point.
Right.
And whether that is obvious to you or not, that's what happens. And when he locks another button, it unlocks the other one. So it never becomes you're completely screwed. So what ends up happening is if you want to, you can plan that out and be like, well, I want to use special moves, so I'm just going to attack him until he locks it, or something like that. Or you have a new challenge that comes up for you. And there are plenty of big boss fights, especially in RPGs, where some sort of shift happens and you can kind of force the choice. And that forces you to change up how you strategize. And you're not necessarily going to do that for every grunt and foot soldier that you come upon. So that is another way that it elevates and it raises. And sometimes a boss fight can be super memorable because of what it gives you rather than what it takes away. I'm thinking of, well, I think also in plenty of RPGs, there are those times where suddenly all my options are gone. All I have is this one win button. Okay, let me use that. And sometimes that win button comes with consequences, which is also super like, can I do anything else? No. But also something like Super Metroid, the Mother Brain fight. It's been long enough, I feel no problem spoiling some of that. You first face off against Mother Brain in the way that you fought her in the original Metroid, just on the Super Nintendo, brain in a case. You're dealing with the environment more than facing off against Mother Brain. She's not hitting you. Everything around her is. Okay, cool. Yeah, it's a cool fight, etc. Great, I took care of that. Oh no, she's getting up. Oh no, she's a big monster. Okay. And you start doing some damage to her, but that at a certain point, she starts doing this huge attack to you that you're completely helpless against it. And towards the end, the baby Metroid that you had just recently re-encountered as a big baby Metroid that it's established recognizes who you are, comes back and saves you. And in doing so, gives you that hyper beam. And there's no other big fight challenge after that. So you having the hyper beam for the rest of the game is no big deal. And getting to have the loss of agency of Mother Brain having you pinned against the wall, literally, to then have that turn around and come back to you. It is still a challenge. You do still have to survive. You can't just stand there and spam the button, but you now have the means of winning. And it feels so very satisfying for that turnaround to happen. And so sometimes boss fights give you that, or if you get to use the Fierce Deity Mask in Majora's Mask, a game that I beat for the first time a couple of months ago, and I've known the Fierce Deity Mask existed because back in the N64 days, a friend of mine game sharked it in, so we just screw around with it. But getting to thematically use it was incredible.
Yeah, I think there are some great boss fights that give you tools only for that fight, so you can just do something different. You know, I think about in Tears of the Kingdom, while I'm not going to spoil what the final boss fight is, you narratively have to get the Master Sword in this game, as you did in the previous game, and like it's tied to finishing the game, and you need the Master Sword for Ganondorf. As far as I can tell in the final fight, it doesn't break like it does anywhere else in the world. You're just powered up and using the only way to defeat Ganondorf. And so, like, that's really cool. In a game where weapons break, for the final boss fight, you don't have to worry about your sword breaking anymore because it is the legendary weapon against the legendary villain. I think those kinds of things are really useful as opposed to, like, other games where you get an item or a MacGuffin that just... I love that Super Metroid one because Metroid actually does that a bunch. Something similar happens without ruining it in Dread as well. That was like an oh shit moment that was really awesome. Like, I like that those kinds of things can happen. I would be remiss if I didn't mention my favorite boss fight from one of my favorite Metroid games. When we're talking about vibes and atmosphere, I think there is no Metroid villain that more A, cements Metroid as a horror game, but also B, shows off how mechanics can just kind of screw with you, and the boss fights can be bizarre in those games. When you fight Nightmare in Metroid Fusion, first of all, there's no clear identity of what Nightmare is. Like, you get logs and stuff, but like he's this weird TV screen with a dripping face that looks like this creature. It's unclear if Samus is just hallucinating at this point, but not only is the music terrifying and the imagery terrifying, but also this boss moves unlike any other boss. It's floaty, flies on and off screen, is hard to aim at because you have to hit a specific part of its face. Like, just kind of, to me, is the embodiment of what an incredible boss fight is, because it's not only teaching you how to use everything you've learned so far, but it is also designed to freak you out and make you panic. And I often die on that fight because I start to panic when my health gets low.
Yeah, and it's another thing that Metroid does really well, where it will ramp up the tension so much that you start making mistakes because you are terrified. And I do enjoy that. In the last year, beat Final Fantasy V for the first time, and one of the X-Death fights that happens, not the final one, but one that happens towards the middle of the game, was a real nail-biter and a challenge, and there was a lot going on, and there was things lost and things gained and whatever else, and it was... Some of my favorite boss fights are those ones where I didn't realize how much I'd been holding my breath until the fight is over and I start breathing again. I mentioned Metal Gear Solid before, and Psycho Mantis is a memorable, if not a good fight. I will argue that most boss fights in Snake Eater are incredible boss fights. I remember fighting the pain and having to hide and pop up and take shots and everything else. That was the first time that I can remember playing games when I was younger, having that like, oh wow. And some of those have gotten easier with time, of course. And I'm very excited about what's going to come when Metal Gear Solid Delta is released, what we'll get from that. But I think those are usually some of the best ones. And I'm racking my brain right now for like, what are my favorite boss fights or what are the most memorable for me? And there's some good ones. Like, I remember Atmo Weapon in Final Fantasy VI being a hell and a half of a time. And I remember the butcher from the first Diablo,
Yeah.
where you don't even always have to fight the butcher because it's just a quest that happens. Sometimes you don't roll that quest in your playthrough. But anybody who has played Diablo and has faced the butcher, if you haven't already gone, fresh meat, you are screwing up. I'm sorry. Because it is such a memorable fight and it is such a terror moment. Oh my God, because it's in usually like the second or third floor of Tristram. You're not ready for that. I was never ready for that. I can beat it regularly now. I'm still not ready for it. Those are memorable boss fights.
Yeah. I think also my favorite signifier of a good boss fight, which you can't quantify, is, but for me has been a consistent experience since I started playing games as a kid, is the next day rose-colored glasses. Like you played a boss fight, done it 10 times, lost every time, can't beat it. You take a beat, walk away for a few hours, come back the next morning, whatever it is, go back to that boss fight, and you beat it in your first or second try. Like, it happened in Kingdom Hearts. It's happened as recently as Metroid AM2R. Like, boss fights that are absolutely dogging me, and I'm like, that's it. I can't play this game anymore. I guess I got to watch a playthrough. And then you come back to it the next day, and you can kind of see the matrix code of the fight and understand. Like, I don't know what causes that to happen scientifically. I'm sure there is an explanation. But for me, I'm never not amazed when it happens because it does happen so consistently.
I have not the scientific explanation, but something to put forth that links to that. I think of good boss fights as tough pieces of music. I was talking about this topic with Sarah before coming in to record, actually like an hour before we started recording. Part of it was something that we both agreed on makes for a good boss fight is one where you can come back after having not played the game for a while and reasonably get back to beating it. If you are saved right before the fight and you've got nothing to practice, you might be screwed. But something where it's, as I ended up putting, it's like, yeah, you just got to run your scales a little bit. And you sort of get the motion of how you do certain combos and hit certain things. Like, all right, let me get that back on my fingers. All right, cool. I'm relearning this and I can do this. There's other times where it's just you're screwed, and that feels unfortunate and unfair. And where I think this phenomenon happens is when one practices music, you learn a lot more when you're not playing. If you have put in good practice, as one does when you die to a boss a dozen times, you are learning the patterns, you're recognizing the patterns, you're seeing what works and what doesn't work. Even if you can't as immediately put it into practice as you wish you could or you feel certain you can, you walk away and your brain keeps working. And your fingers haven't forgotten it that much in the day. Like, it's very quick to get your fingers back to being warm on that. And all of that sort of subconscious thought that's been going on in the pattern recognition, you're coming at it fresh again. And all of the patterns you've built and went, oh, but it's this, you've had the time to construct it. And yes, I think those are absolutely the great boss fights because they are a challenge and they will punish you, but they are not insurmountable. I don't believe that every game needs to be a punishing challenge, but if we're talking about a good, memorable boss battle, yeah, I shift my opinion just a little.
Yeah. I mean, I think also with punishing boss battles, something we haven't talked about, Bleak Neon Black mentions the Hydra from God of War on PS2, the original God of War. And he's like, this one is easy. Phases. Nothing makes a better boss battle than phases. I remember the first Hydra or whatever it was boss from the first God of War game. That to me was the quintessential boss battle, different phases with a certain strategy you had to figure out. And we touched on this a little bit earlier. I come and go on phases in boss battles. Like early boss battles with phases, sure, throw them at me. Let's do different stuff. If I'm on the final boss, I've got one health potion left. I've got no resurrection items left, and it goes into a second phase. My eyes grow to the size of dinner plates as I see that health bar regrow, and I'm like, no, thank you. Like, it happened so many times in Elden Ring, I couldn't even tell you, and like, I can't stand that.
You gotta learn to expect it, otherwise.
Right, and that doesn't mean it's a bad boss fight. Obviously, I understand what Bleak Neon Black is saying, but like, for me, it's like that happened more times than I can count in FromSoft games because that's kind of their nature.
Mm-hmm.
And it's every time I go, oh, shoot.
Where in contrast, I love that. I love phases, especially if they are distinctly different phases. It's one thing where it's sort of a like, all right, you've got me to half health. Now I'm faster. which is its own challenge and is its own fun. But the notion of, oh, I thought I defeated you. I used everything I had. Oh, God, no. Provided there is one quality of life thing. If I lose, I can quickly start the fight again.
Yep. And that's like not the FromSoft way. You start from scratch.
No, it's not. And I have not completed Kingdom Hearts 2 because Sarah and I got hung up at the Zaldin fight.
Oh, no.
And we had to watch that cutscene every single time.
Yep.
And going back to it later just felt like, no, that's fine. We got distracted doing other things. Kingdom Hearts 3 came out and it's et cetera. So when you have to go through those, like when we've talked about in other episodes about other sorts of games, you know, you can die as many times as you want in Celeste. You come back quick.
Yeah.
You come back quick and that's fine. But yeah, if you want to throw phases of a boss at me, start me again. Don't make me lose my resources. And if I have the same resources at the start every single time, I can figure out a strategy. And now I know how to portion that out, how to do that. The first time that I was playing through Samus Returns on the 3DS and I realized that the Metroids part way can sometimes run away and then jump me later.
Yep.
Had me then rethinking how I portion out my fights and how I portion out how I'm doing things and what I'm doing. So it can be a very good thing. And I very much agree. Phases are another way that you can make the fight more epic. You can raise the tension or you can make it feel like a more special encounter one way or another, whatever that means for what the game is.
Yeah. I want to mention before and give a shout out to someone we've mentioned a lot on this show recently. The incredible Caden over at Great Game Debate mentioned Sekiro's Genichiro for a perfect boss fight that comes to mind. My perfect boss fight tests your mastery of game mechanics, available thus far, one that you simply cannot defeat if you don't understand the game. Such bosses are usually the most challenging, but also the most memorable and rewarding. And I mostly agree with that. I think it's kind of a summation of all the stuff we've talked about, right? There are non-mechanical things that can make a boss fight memorable, but some of the boss fights that stick with you the most are the ones that are mechanical, I think, for me, because it is that muscle memory, right? And that you're kind of thinking about it afterwards. I think of the final boss fight from Metroid Dread that I know a bunch of friends who dropped off after that because it felt impossible. And to me, it didn't feel that impossible because I always felt like I was learning every time I fought it. But I can see that. I can see you hitting that wall. I mean, I hit that wall a ton in Elden Ring and Dark Souls 3. And it's why I'm hesitant to take on Bloodborne. Although I do know that both Dave and Katie have my back. They said they would reinstall it if I started playing it, which is always fun.
It's a ticking time bomb for me. I think I'm going to start from Soft Games with Bloodborne.
Well, if you do, we can play together online. And honestly, that might be worth streaming because we are both fairly inept at those games. And I think it would be, if nothing else, entertaining.
Be a good time.
But yeah, I think that ultimately the summation of this conversation is there is no right answer to this, right? There are some right answers for what would make a bad boss fight. And we didn't go over that many of them because in typical Fun and Games fashion, we celebrated the stuff we love. But I think good boss fights, many things go into a good boss fight, but only one or two things need to not be there or go wrong to get a bad boss fight, like the Joker fight we mentioned earlier. I think bad boss fights are also ones that are boring. And I think that's where the Yakuza ones, which I did mention earlier. So we did talk about some bad boss fights. Like a lot of the Yakuza boss fights, I think they're bad because they don't do anything interesting. Like when I'm fist fighting a tiger, that's a great boss fight because honestly, it's just dumb. But like when I'm fighting a Yakuza boss or a family boss and he's like just a guy punching you, if there's nothing mechanically that makes it interesting, then I tend to fall off. And I think that a lot of the boss fights we talked about today, even the non-boss fights like Mr. X, like there's something that there is that X factor of whether it's a combination of the different elements that really make it stand out. And I think it's easy to talk about the good boss fights because they are memorable, but some of the really bad ones can be memorable as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because bosses don't necessarily have to make or break a game. If you design the game around boss fights, that's its own thing. And we didn't even get into how we feel about boss rushes.
Right.
Which is entirely its own thing. And maybe we'll talk about that at a later point, or maybe you can let us know. Because we certainly didn't cover every single boss fight or kind of boss encounter or what's great or the worst or whatever about these things. And that's where you come in. Let us know. And there's so many great ways to let us know. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at funandgamespod. You can email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. Let us know what you think of this episode, previous episodes, what you'd like us to talk about, or who you'd like us to have on in future episodes. You can also check out certainpov.com and find not only a permanent invite link to our Discord server, but also a lot of other fantastic Certain POV podcasts. If you want to always be able to see a feed of what we're up to, or maybe if you are able and willing to support us in a financial way, you can visit our Patreon at patreon.com/funandgamespod. You don't have to donate anything in order to be able to see most of our content, but we would also like to shout out those patrons up on the high scoreboard: Alex Lavelle, Case Aiken, Daniel Needon, Alejandro Alves, Film It Yourself, Patrick Edwards, Rob Tremarco, Robert Proyne, and Sean Bowen. Thank you so much. Please wait for the weak point to show itself before entering your initials. Otherwise, it's going to counterattack while its tail's up with its laser.
And one-shot you.
Absolutely. Always one-shot you. They wait till the final boss before one-shotting, I swear.
Also, links for all that stuff is in the show notes down below. You can find a link to the Discord server, to our Patreon, to all the places you can rate and review us and beyond. So please go check that out. Also, if you want to find Geoff and I online, you can find Geoff in most places as Geoff Makes Noise. And you can find me at most places at DJ_Stormageddon, Twitter, Instagram, stuff like that. We love taking folks' questions on social. We're trying to do that more on the Discord and social media. So like Geoff said, if you have suggestions for topics or just want to collaborate or add your voice to what we work on, please feel free to hit us up in any and all of those places.
Yes. Now, thank you to everybody who answered the call on Discord and on Twitter. We look forward to hearing from all of you again on future topics, and those of you who haven't yet spoken, because I know that the best boss fight out there is Mysterio in Spider-Man 2, and I can't wait to hear from you about that and why, because we couldn't do this without you. This is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am at AK Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Hey, Nerf herders.
You sure you want to go with that?
Hey, everyone.
There we go. More inviting.
Have you ever had a movie that you really wanted to love, but something holds you back?
Or one that you did love in spite of a flaw?
Well, I'm Case Aiken.
And I'm Sam Alisea.
And on Another Pass, we sit down with cool guests to look at movies that we find fascinating.
But flawed.
And we try to imagine what could have been done when they were made to give them that little push.
We're not experts. We just believe in criticism.
Constructive criticism.
Sure.
So come take another pass at some movies with us.
And every now and then, we can celebrate movies that did it on their own, too.
You can find us at certainpov.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Pass it on.
CPOV.
certainpov.com.